So I'm delighted to welcome General Sir Peter Wall as our speaker today. Peter is a 4-star general who joined the Royal Engineers and has served in the British Army for over 40 years, finishing as its chief, the Chief of the General Staff. The early part of his career until 1990 was during the Cold War, when the focus was on deterring an invasion of Western Europe by the Soviet bloc. Some thought it would never happen. So his take on what is happening now in Eastern Europe and the implications for NATO and the West will be very interesting, and I know that you're keen to hear about it. Peter is now the CEO of Amicus. Amicus is a Jersey-based advisory business which specialises in imparting military and commercial leadership expertise with emphasis on strategic planning and execution, leadership development and organisational resilience. Peter is also a director of General Dynamics, which is a $68 billion US defence and aerospace corporation, and is president of Combat Stress, the UK military veterans' mental health charity. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sir Peter to the stage. Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you very much indeed. Tim from Bedell Christian, thank you very much for lunch. Greetings everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be back here in Jersey. Didn't think that I'd ever come here to talk about a Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's very 20th century, isn't it? But anyway, what I'm planning to do is talk to you a little bit, if I may, about the history behind this and what I believe has caused it. Maybe a little bit about the way in which the response from the West has been calibrated. Maybe dwell on the sort of delta, if you like, in outcomes for Vladimir Putin, what he might have been seeking and what he's actually got, and then finish off by talking about what it means for us, because I think the effects could be quite far-reaching and quite protracted. So I've been asked to speak for just under half an hour, and then apparently there's about 25 minutes of questions, so I'll be delighted to open the discussion. So this is absolutely Putin's war, more than it's Russia's war, but I don't think we should assume that he doesn't still have quite a lot of public support in Russia, such as his ability to control the news agenda and the loyalty, the natural loyalty he has from Russian people, not least because they see him as having enhanced Russia's status in the world. Interesting observation, but that's apparently what's going on. It's also partly our war because we in the West have failed to anticipate this and failed to deter him from doing it. And as I say, it's very much a 20th century war. It's pretty well unbelievable that when you switch on your televisions nowadays, what you see looks like it's a kind of movie from 20, 30 years ago. It's actually happening under our noses in Eastern Europe. And the roots are actually in World War II and the Cold War. Not least because the ground they're fighting over was fought over very viciously between the Germans and the Soviet Union, Red Army, in the period 1941 to 44. And just, can we have the, Liam, can we have the map up, please? Just to pick one location that you'll have seen in your news recently, Kharkiv, which is on this map, known back in the day as Kharkov. This is the fifth battle for Kharkiv in 80-odd years, the first four being between the Germans and the Soviets, where it took 4 attempts for the Soviets to recapture Kharkiv in what is a great victory, what was a great victory. And if you were to take the Russian formation, which is called the First Guards Tank Army, don't you love these kind of evocative expressions? Strength of about 30,000 people, with 500 quite modern tanks. They performed with staggering distinction in the Great Patriotic War and were able to push the Germans, with a lot of other formations, out of the Soviet Union back to Berlin. It was their job to capture Kharkiv 80-odd days ago and then from Kharkiv roll on to Kiev over a period of 3 or 4 days. Well, that army was stopped in its tracks by Ukrainian forces, which I have to say must have been a surprise to them. It was certainly a surprise to all of us. Hundreds of tanks were destroyed or captured. Thousands of men have either been killed, wounded, gone missing, surrendered, or just run away. A British parallel for this in terms of its impact on the national psyche for us would be for us to try and do another rerun of the Normandy landings. It's tempting, I know, and fail. That would be the status of the failure against former glories. Stalin eventually prevailed against Hitler in 1945, we know that. He lost 27 million people under arms in the process. Such is the Slav way in war. I mean, for example, by comparison, we and the Americans lost 600,000 or 700,000 each. In Russia, even modern Russia, with a tyrant like Putin, life is cheap and the youth are expendable. What's more, these losses fuel the insatiable Russian appetite for a sense of victimhood. That's a big driver in what's going on here. And of course, that victimhood drives even more losses, or the tolerance of even more losses. So it's a pretty perverse situation. Now, I think one of the things that we all think is driving Putin's resentment is the West's failure to recognize that massive strategic success and huge sacrifice from the pre-Cold War era, and of course the way in which the Cold War, which did sustain Russia's status as a global power, the way that ended and the way in which Western Europe in particular rubbed Russia's noses, or the Russian Federation's noses in it after that. I mean, Russia has a population of 145 million people. It's the largest country in the world in terms of landmass. It occupies 1/8 of the occupiable land in the globe. It's got an economy about equal to Spain. That's another source of frustration and a reason why we don't perhaps recognize Russia for the might it could have. And I would say that resentment has grown over the last couple of decades since Putin took office. And if we were, cast our minds back to the days when I was working in Whitehall, listen to our learned friends in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, they would tell us, well, Peter, the resurgence of Russian nationalism is entirely predictable. To which we in the MOD would respond, well, that may be true, but it's a shame we keep failing to predict it. And that has happened again. So over this period of Putin's growing frustration, NATO has gradually got more complacent. It's turned a blind eye to some quite significant legal and geopolitical excesses. Think of Georgia in 2007, we barely noticed it. Think of all of the other things that he's done in other countries around the world. Think of what he did with the Skripals in Salisbury, a place I drove through this morning on the way here. No whiff of nerve agent this morning, as far as I can tell. All of these things were kind of glossed over, including Russia's interference in Syria. We also felt in the West that, we fought so hard in the Cold War, not a shot was fired, that we deserve a peace dividend. So we cut our defence expenditure and we channeled the money into other very honourable causes, mainly social and welfare issues, and that's where the dividend went. That's a very hard habit for modern politicians to kick, but as a pal of mine in the MOD, a wise old owl in the MOD said, they've missed the point. Peace is the dividend. And what we've done, actually, is trade that in. So I do believe that the West has a chance to recalibrate its thinking about how it wants to take this forward, because I don't see any scenario in which this is like lancing the final boil of the Russians or similar misdemeanors, and we can rest easy and carry on as we were at the end of last year. So this short-termism, complacency, apathy has sent a sort of distinct signal to Putin that he could get away with it. Why did he pick his time around now? Well, leadership in the West looks pretty weak. We had the Afghan debacle inspired by almost solely by Mr. Biden last year. That was a pretty dismal time. We've got quite a lot of quite a lot of political shifts going on in Europe. We had French elections. We had a new chancellor in Germany from the Green Party, and of course we had the shenanigans with UK Brexit and everything else, and the general buffoonery going on in the British government. So that's probably why he picked that time. Inadvertently, Putin's achieved something we couldn't achieve. He's brought NATO together. He's created that common purpose that, in our perception, had ebbed away, even though we know deep down it was always there. It's been proven that now. Our leaders just failed to spot it, and it was more convenient and easier politically for them to retain their seats by taking this dividend and spending it on other things, all of which everybody enjoys. Who doesn't want to help the needy, who doesn't want to improve health and education and so on. I think the other thing that's gone on over this period is that NATO nations in their sort of European Union guise have prioritised geo-economic issues over geopolitical issues. So what we've tried to do is forward trading relationships with the Russians. We've taken their cheap and plentiful gas, for example, less so UK, but certainly a number of European nations further east have done that in spades, under the loose assumption that this type of trade would generate political harmony. Germany has certainly pursued that as a policy, quite convenient, has slightly backfired. The dependencies that have been created over time and the phenomenal investment that's gone into setting up that infrastructure, Nord Stream 2, etc., now sort of, is it going to be used again, or is it just a bit of scrap under the ocean? We'll find out. And also our dependency on Russia for other things, which is inescapable because they're the only people who've got it, like, for example, 70% of the global supply of titanium. And vast amounts of the world's cereal crops, about which we will certainly be hearing more and more. So I think this sort of very cohesive response by NATO has surprised us as much as it's surprised the Russians. And of course, it's not going to have an immediate impact, but it's certainly going to put the Russians under more and more economic pressure, provided we can sustain our resolve. And I have to say, one can already detect a little bit of minds wandering onto other things. The West is going through a sort of post-strategic phase where we don't think about things with anything like the gravity that we used to. This is an opportunity for us to get back on a horse and start thinking a bit more clearly, but it's going to need a major psychological reset in Western capitals to do that, both individually and collectively. I hope it happens, but I'm not holding my breath. Take the UK. The UK has had a pretty good campaign, certainly superficially on this so far. We've been out in front, but our rhetoric quite often outstrips our actual intentions. That, again, is a sort of quite a salient feature of modern Westminster behaviour. I'm sceptical we'll see UK increasing its defence commitments, in fact still scheduled to reduce the army by about another 10,000 people. I don't think that can be right in the current circumstances. It's certainly sending quite a strange message about how seriously we take all this. And if that's our response to a more uncertain world and we rely on others to do more, while we can engage in our progressive politics and our culture wars and worrying about which statues we should deface and all that kind of stuff. So, to Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky is clearly the hero of the hour politically, backed up by some pretty capable military performances, particularly from his militia people. But, these are people who have every incentive to fight. They're fighting for their own turf, on their own turf. The clarity of intent from Zelensky, massively impressive at the beginning. Women and children out, get them away out of the war zone, men stay and fight. We saw all those heart-wrenching images of people kissing goodbye to their families on railway stations, picking up a weapon and going eastwards and northwards while their families went in the opposite direction. I mean, that's tough. And they did it. And they have the ultimate in common purpose. I mean, you know, we in Commerce spend a lot of time crafting our purpose. This one didn't take long. Basically, kill Russians. And they've done it pretty effectively. Perhaps we should now contrast the fortunes on the battlefield of the Russians and the Ukrainians. So when we're analysing what an army looks like, we talk about three things. Conceptual stuff, how good are we at thinking? How good's our doctrine? Is it up to snuff? Is it going to outwit the opponent? What's the state of our sort of physical being in terms of equipment and our ability to use it, maintain it, sustain it? And most important, what we call the moral element. Are our people committed to fight, go way beyond the extra mile, and so on? And there's a direct read across to business here. I mean, what are the things that a business needs? It needs a smart business model with relevant, up-to-date, proportionate processes. So that's my conceptual piece. It obviously needs the factors of production for whatever it's making, whether it's vats to make wine or machines to dig holes or IT to do IT things. So, what's the quality and sustainability of infrastructure and equipment? And of course, most of all, the thing on which we spend most of our money in business is the cost of our people. Are we getting the passion and commitment from our people so that they're going to turn up and give of their best? These are the three things in a business that give you your competitive edge, and it's no different in the military. The read across is very significant. The Russians have demonstrated about, single figures percent, I would say, in each of those aspects, to an extent that has staggered me. Certainly on the first two. No workable doctrine or credible drills, very poorly maintained equipment, which they're not very well trained in using, and then most of all, dismal morale, for reasons we can probably explain more easily than the other two of those things, because these Russians are not up for the fight, because they're fighting their own kith and kin. They're conscripts, many of them, in the army for a year, not hugely trained and anticipating going to war, and suddenly they're tricked into sort of taking a left turn off a training exercise and heading across the border into Ukraine. That goes to explain why the initial assaults in this fight were a cataclysmic failure. It's hard to emphasise just how badly that went. And whilst there's been no sort of public explanation of what's been going on in Russia, there's been the odd sort of glossing over the fact that they've had to completely change their mind about what they're trying to do. And, we were going for Kiev, but we've had a better idea. We're going to go back to the Donbass to the east. So if you look at the map here, you can see where they were anticipating coming. There was a point here somewhere. Where they were. This isn't going to get like one of Monty's briefings, I promise you. They were trying to come in here. They were trying to get to Kiev as fast as possible to unseat the government and stick their own stooge in there. And, in fact, our friends, the 1st Guards Tank Army, were going to do this. Well, they got to there, and then they got pushed back. All the guys who came down here, including the people who took this big airfield north of Kiev, 200 helicopter assault, repelled. They got kicked off with their tails between their legs, went back up here. So we've had to, if you're in the Russian General Staff, they already had this bit. They're having to satisfy that they already had this bit. They're having to satisfy themselves with gains here and here, which are proving ever harder to hang on to. So it's looking a bit tricky for Putin to describe this as a success. And the main effort, as we would call it in the military, which was to go for the capital, has now been given up for a much more sort of subordinate auxiliary ambition of trying to exercise better control over the Donbass region in the east. Lots of reasons why this happened. Putin thought he could sort of steal in there under dead of night. His intelligence people had told him that the the whole fabric of Ukrainian society would breathe a huge sigh of relief as soon as they turned up, and they would crack pretty quickly. And so he didn't plan a proper military operation. He planned a specialist military operation, which is nonsense. And above all, he failed to prioritize. And like in business, attack everywhere, you attack nowhere. So he's now compensating for that by very, very aggressive use of indirect fire, i.e. artillery and rockets, where he doesn't have to put so many people into the front line and risk their lives. Of course, the consequences of that for Ukrainian infrastructure, as you've seen, are catastrophic. It's going to take many years to rebuild this place, even based on how far he's got this at this point. In contrast, as we know, the Ukrainians have done extremely well through this phenomenal resolve, supplied and reinforced by NATO equipment, but above all, the killer factor for the Ukrainians is their morale and their moral commitment to the fight. As Napoleon taught us, the moral is to the physical as three is to one. And there's no better commitment, there's no better example of that than what we're seeing here. So if you look at what's going on in Putin's bunker, when he embarked on this venture, we can assume the following, I think. He wanted to enhance Russia's status in the world by integrating former Soviet bloc states, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, into the current Russian Federation with a sort of religious fervour. You either come back to Mother Russia or you're a heretic and we'll treat you accordingly and sort of write down your viability as a nation. That's what he's trying to do with the Ukrainians. They obviously want to be noticed and respected. Well, I think they've been noticed and actually feared will do. Malign actions are okay if it gets the world attention, and Putin seems to have a sort of penchant for Stalin-esque ruthlessness, complete disregard for human rights and the laws of war, deepening this rift between progressive liberal systems in the West and his autocratic regime, which he thinks is inherently superior to our way of running our countries. He wants an indirect ability to control other nations around the world through energy and food supremacy, and perhaps above all, considering his point in life, he's 69, he's not in great health, he wants to cement his own place in Russian history, restoring Russia to its Cold War status as a major regional and significant global power. So does that explain this show of strength? Well, I don't think this is a show of strength. I think it's a display of Russia's weakness and Putin's personal paranoia. But that doesn't mean it's easy. I mean, let's just dwell for a second on Putin. He absolutely embodies this Slav characteristic of victimization. He sees NATO, notwithstanding, what it says in all of its strategic information, as an aggressive organization trying to belittle Russia. So we suspect he's not in great health. Is he actually psychologically deranged? Well, there's a lot of evidence from the decisions he's taken that could be the case. But we shouldn't take too much store from that. Is anybody going to get rid of him anytime soon? I think not. I think the chances of somebody rolling a hand grenade under the door or getting close enough to shoot him are extremely low, and we shouldn't hang any hopes on that. Of course, if it happened, it might be a bonus, but it might also create all sorts of very strange instabilities in Russia as people clamour for power. Changes of power in Moscow tend to be pretty violent. And of course, the nuclear weapons are there the whole time. So you never quite know what sort of lunatic's going to get their hands on those. Putin, I think we do know, is an incredibly thin-skinned individual. And those people who've met him think he needs very, very delicate handling, because if he's humiliated, he's likely to do things that are even more reckless than he's done already. And I don't think we see that sort of respect for that risk in the way that quite a lot of Western politicians, especially British politicians, talk about it. So that's an area to be more cautious. Putin has made these very, very clear threats about resorting to tactical nuclear weapons. How seriously do we take that, and how much should we take counsel of our fears and be cowed by my earlier point into giving him more respect than he deserves? Very difficult line to tread. We seem to be getting it about right, notwithstanding the odd bit of loose rhetoric. And I think if he were prepared to go beyond what we would regard as acceptable, he would have done it already by using chemical weapons, not necessarily tactical nuclear weapons. I think another big risk in Putin's case is that he's not very well informed about what's going on. One of the consequences of running a sort of totalitarian information operation for your business, for your country, I don't recommend it in business either, in your country, is that your own information is very, very much filtered. There are not many people who are prepared to walk in and say, Comrade Vladimir, we're losing even worse today because of the mistakes I made. So he's getting a pretty thin feel for reality, and so difficult to know how good his decision-making can ever be, really. So what's he actually getting out of this? Well, he's obviously getting a bloody nose, but it's not obvious to me that he thinks he's losing. War's dynamic. There's a history of the Russians doing pretty badly in these sorts of conflicts before they manage to turn it around quite quickly and do better. And, if he's following the Stalin model, he's in 1942, which is when Stalin was at lowest ebb before he managed to regain his status and boot the Germans out. So, Kharkov in 1942 was not a good operation, but in 1943 they were triumphant. So maybe he takes store in that. He has managed to achieve, it would appear, the exact opposite of what he was trying to do in terms of the growth of NATO and increasingly, in fact, doubling his border between Russia and NATO through Finland, which I think will go ahead. And that's a bit of an affront to Putin. Very interesting that the Finnish premier should go to see Putin to tell him. They've had a long history of balancing tensions across that border, and it must have been a very tough decision for the Finns to take, but they've done it. We're going to see increased expenditure in defence and security by a lot of nations to the immediate west of the new Russian border, wherever that is. Not sure about UK, but countries like Poland are going to upgun quite considerably. That's not what Putin wanted to achieve. He never believed he'd be subject to these economic sanctions, and he probably didn't expect the pariah status that he's probably not entirely familiar with to be quite as significant as it's going to be, a sort of expulsion from the world community. And, they may never be able to take part in the Eurovision Song Contest, for example. And then over time, a massive loss of income from energy. So it's pretty well 180 degrees out from what he might have expected, but there is an upside. It plays to our sense of victimhood. That will come in again. So how's this going to end? Well, we've all got various theories about this. So we've discounted the idea that Putin gets conveniently shot and whisked away and somebody more peaceable takes over. We can definitely see what was meant to be a very short military engagement of a few days. We're now at day something like 86, I think. We're starting to lose count. It's now becoming very, very protracted. There's very little manoeuvre. The front line probably changes by a maximum of, 100 metres or a few hundred metres a day, maybe a kilometre or two. So it's that sort of situation. Still has the potential to keep civilians in danger and military people under significant threat. So that could easily be one situation where it just grinds on and on and on. A negotiated ceasefire where a number of influential nations get Zelensky and Putin round the table and say, right, let's draw some lines on a map, a map like this, let's, bit of horse trading, which, people have done before, and come up with some sort of negotiated position and a ceasefire. I think that's unlikely, and I also think it's undesirable. I think it's unlikely because Zelensky's blood is up. He's as Slavic as the rest. his people want their pound of flesh. He wants it all back, including Crimea. That's such an extreme request. Putin can never accede to it without total loss of face. I mean, that's like 18,000 degrees out of kilter with what he was seeking to do, and so that's not going to happen. So it would also, were it to happen, the reason why I think it's unwelcome is that it gives Putin a platform on which to regroup and have another go sometime in the next 2 or 3 years. Because the Russians are very, very determined people, and they're not going to give up easily. So what we have to do is, faced with not many attractive options here, is enable the Ukrainians to succeed. And it's interesting how some European nations are already starting to talk about, come on, let's get round the conference table, which I think is quite insulting to Zelensky and the Ukrainian people at this point. But it doesn't stop them saying it. And of course, they tend to be the nations who have the most to lose from what they think is going to be the outcome of this. Countries like Italy, who are nigh on 100% dependent on Russia for energy. Certainly oil and gas. So, what are the impacts for us over here? Well, we're well out of range, aren't we, of the fight and the immediate security spin-offs, mostly. But I think other implications of this are going to be quite far-reaching, and they're going to be difficult to predict precisely, but we've got the gist. So obviously, Western nations in the round, whether it's UK or not discussed, are going to have to reverse their peace dividend and reinvest some savings from other areas into stiffening defence. I think that has to happen. I think we're going to, so that has an opportunity cost for all sorts of things. I think we're going to see more Russian subterfuge, and that's going to play out particularly in areas like cyber and Russian support for organised crime. So that's coming to infrastructure, national infrastructure, but it could also be coming to businesses. It could be coming to the banking system, it could be coming to all sorts of large IT systems that inform the way our countries function, or indeed big businesses function. And the side effects of that are a threat to all of us. And then when you consider that the world wasn't all that peachy on February the 24th before this invasion happened, we can see these Ukrainian effects being overlaid on raw material shortages that were there already, supply chain fragilities, not least the legacy of COVID in China still, higher energy costs, which it's exacerbating, possible energy shortages. So lots of things that impact on business profitability, coming at quite a bad time when we're trying to recover from the trough that many people experienced during the COVID era. All of this stimulating inflation, which we don't like and are not familiar with. We see that also as a sort of 20th century phenomenon. Interest rates going to levels we certainly, the younger generation in the West, can't visualise. Memories are short about things like what happened in UK when we came out of the ERM in 1992 and rates went up to 15%. Potential recession and the much talked about stagflation, as well as food shortages pushing prices up, fertiliser shortages orchestrated by Putin to stimulate reduced crops in this year and further afield in places like South America, who are dependent very much on that, and the prospect of civil unrest around all sorts of countries in the world. Cast our mind back to the Arab Spring. That all started because of food shortages. Ukraine and Russia, between them, provide about 80% of Egypt's wheat and grain, for example, and the same is true of lots of other Middle Eastern nations. So we're going to feel the impact of these things directly or indirectly in all of our economies to a greater or lesser extent. And I think we're going to see a natural tendency to shift away from dependency on global supply chains into more regional and more local ones. But that's going to take quite a lot of time to unravel. And it's going to require quite a lot of investment. And we're going to be in choppy waters while those adjustments are made. And then I think more fundamentally, what's coming out of this is a geopolitical shift where any sense of rapprochement between liberal democracies and autocracies like Russia and China we can now say those have failed. So all of that IP we gave to the Chinese in the last 25 years, hoping that it would stimulate a more democratic China, well, that hasn't worked, and neither have our trade relations really done anything to soften the behaviour in Putin's Russia. So these rifts are now deeper. I think they're going to stay deeper. Those experiments are over. You could say, and I don't want to sound too dramatic, that we're embarking on what could be a new Cold War in Europe, a new boundary from the Baltic to the Black Sea, on this side of which there will be some fence sitters, like countries like Serbia and Hungary, who still have that Slav connection with Russia. So this is now structural. We can see it taking a decade or two before we're in a right frame of mind to do the sort of reset that would be required for us to get Russia back into the European fold. So I believe this is, in summary, it's playing out in front of our eyes as if we're in extra time in a football match, but actually it's a much deeper, more significant and protracted impact than we would have dared imagine around Christmas time. Thank you very much for listening.